We can't really understand early American history unless we understand the context, particularly the European context from which early American history emerges. That context includes this major revolution of inventions, of science, and of reason. Let me start with the 1450s. In the 1450s, there was an invention that was made that revolutionized certainly all of Europe and later the world, particularly America. Prior to that time, if you wanted a book, basically you had to pay a cleric to copy the book. In other words, if you wanted a copy of the Bible, somebody would have to sit down and start with Genesis chapter 1 and write it word for word, letter for letter, all the way through the book of Revelation. It took a long time. You can imagine it was very labor intensive and probably very expensive. In other words, very few people had Bibles. Very few people had any books at all. Very few people were able to read because the lack of books being available. Now, in the 1450s, a German by the name of Gutenberg came up with an idea. He took little wood blocks and he carved letters into them. And so he would arrange the letters into words, and then into sentences, and then into entire pages. So we'd have what we call removable type. And he'd put it into a plate, then he'd put ink on it, then he'd take a piece of paper, set it down on the ink, and suddenly you have the entire first page of the Bible. You want one? Here's one for you. A little more ink, one for you, one for you. One. Can you imagine what those scribes thought when they first saw this happen? Wow, that took me forever just to do one page. And here you go, one after another after another. This is called the invention of the printing press. And what it did was it not only made Bibles available to everybody, it made books available to everybody. And that the proliferation of books would make a revolution in science, in philosophy, in reason. And there would be a change in the way that people thought about the world because of Gutenberg's gift to Europeans and to the world, as it were. Now, there was a man prior to that, just before Gutenberg, named Copernicus. And Copernicus was an astronomer who put forth a theory that the Earth, we call it the geocentric theory, that the Earth was not, in fact, the center of the world. Up until Copernicus, most people believed all the stars and the sun and the moon, everything revolved around the Earth. That's the geocentric theory. Well, Copernicus looked at the movement of the planets and looked at the movement of the stars, and he put a theory together and says, you know what, it makes better sense if we put the sun, that is the heliocentric theory, at the center of our universe. And in fact, he set forth that theory. The authorities didn't like it too much. He kind of backed off on his theory a little bit. But then later, when the telescope was invented, a man by the name of Galileo looked out and he found moons going around Jupiter. And when he saw the moons of Jupiter, he said, look, I have proof positive here that not all heavenly bodies revolve around the Earth. There's certainly some revolving around Jupiter. And of course, Galileo got in deep trouble with the authorities. They arrested him. He was under house arrest until the day he died. I believe the church apologized to Galileo in something like 1995. But Galileo was the one who put forth Copernicus's theory and said it is indeed a scientific fact that the Earth is not the center of the universe. So this is an example of the change that happened between what was referred to as the Dark Ages, when basically people were not into science and reason and philosophy, and a new movement now called the Enlightenment. You see the contrast, Dark Ages and Enlightenment. And the major shift that occurs here is, what is our authority? Prior to the Enlightenment, the main authority was the sacred text. How do we know that the earth is the center of the universe? Well, it says so in the Bible. It says the sun goes up and the sun goes down. If the Bible says it, it must be true. There are some other authorities, such as Aristotle and Aquinas and whatnot, who are considered to be almost infallible. But here comes the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment philosophers are saying, It's not the Bible that's authoritative, but experience itself. Empirical, that means observable evidence, is what tells me what is right and what is wrong. And that gives us the Enlightenment thinkers, the Enlightenment philosophy. Perhaps the most notable Enlightenment philosopher is Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was a genius, no question about it. And he conceived the universe as a great machine, that God made the universe as a clock, and it could be predicted. It operated as a machine, and its formulas, its behavior is very, very predictable. And so he discovered certain formulas. Perhaps the most famous is gravity, and he published his understanding of this new machine in various books that became sort of the Bible for the enlightened philosophers. He also discovered or came up with a system called calculus to deal with a lot of mathematical issues, particularly regarding infinity. But to show that Isaac Newton himself was still somewhat in the Dark Ages, when he was asked what his greatest contribution was as a philosopher, as a thinker, as a writer, he said it was his commentary on the genealogies found in the Bible book of Chronicles. It wasn't gravity, it wasn't calculus, it was his Bible commentary that he was most proud of. Now, not just the physical world became a study for the Enlighteners. Many of the enlightened philosophers wanted to figure out how governments came to be. What is the natural thinking behind governments? Men like Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza, John Locke and Rousseau wrote down these theories about what they called social contracts. Social contracts basically work like this. They say sometime way back in the primitive world, there was some brute, and this brute was very dangerous. And so smaller people got together and said, none of us can take this brute on alone, so let's compact together. Let's agree, we have a contract, that we will support each other in fighting against this terrible, evil person, this brute. And in that agreement comes, according to these philosophers, the first governments, the first societies where we're agreeing to be cooperative, we're agreeing to operate together. And it's out of this social contract theory that Americans, such as Thomas Jefferson, will establish a new government in the United States, very clearly referring back to people like John Locke as their inspiration.